In the 2024 version of D&D, the moment you hit level 5, you own property. In Skyrim, you can buy all manner of homes, including a fully personalizable homestead, if you're willing to spend the, $5 on the DLC nowadays. Animal Crossing, Fallout, Final Fantasy, even inhospitable environments like being stranded on a near-deserted island, surviving the aftermath of a nuclear apocalypse, or even whatever the hell's going on in Final Fantasy these days. All of these have systems that allow you to build up your own home base that is precisely and only owned by you. Ostensibly, as I've seen in much of online discourse, part of the draw of these features is access to an escapist fantasy. There is a certain segment of society for whom home ownership is an escapist fantasy. It is something that is currently perceived to be out of their reach and likely to be out of their reach forever. If this all sounds really strange to you, that home ownership cannot really be fantasy, well, maybe you're part of that small section of society that hasn't been struck by the bug to reorganise rugs and lamps and light shades to your heart's content for hours and hours on end to make the room just feel perfect in a completely virtual world. Congratulations on that, by the way. But for the rest of us, I want to dive into this topic. How can home ownership really be escapism, or indeed fantasy? Is this a valid interpretation? Does it make sense? Well, to do that, we're going to have to look at a lot of things. The history of the fantasy genre, and indeed the history of the ownership of land itself. So, a tough task. Let me give you a potted history of owning places. Early hominids had shelter as a key priority. They moved around a lot. Early hominids spread around the globe relatively quickly. Our ancestors were indeed a curious, wandering folk. They crossed land bridges and made their homes on the other side, often getting stranded when those land bridges receded again. Understandably, the area that we lived in was key. We had to understand, whatever group that was living in this place had to understand the local flora and fauna. What was safe to eat, what was safe to hunt, and what you should probably leave well alone. Understanding weather patterns and local geography is also really important, and all these tasks become harder if you're constantly on the move, if you're living a nomadic lifestyle. So settlement starts to make sense as an option, partly to give you an understanding of the world around you that is fixed and semi-repeatable, and also as a way to protect the more vulnerable members of society, such as pregnant women and children, having a home base that can be guarded, defended, and protected, establishing, essentially, early humans' mark on a territory. But other creatures also claim territory. Bears, tigers, and other hominids as well. So the best thing we can do is establish ourselves strongly with a settlement and assert control over this space that gradually weakens as we go further out into the wild. Through repeated conflicts with beasts and people to establish a land, it becomes tied to personal and community identity. Blood has been spilled for it, and therefore it has more meaning. With that, we fast forward. Some tribes do retain this model that we just discussed, settling in a place, tribes and clans establishing a local territory that is theirs, largely abutted by other groups that are either ethnically or personally or communitarily slightly different to them. Others, especially in resource-poor areas, turn nomadic. They move from place to place within a broad-ranging area, exploiting the natural resources of their grand land, still claiming this territory as their own because it is the territory that they roam and hunt and use. There are certain pockets which are more likely for nomads to settle in year after year after year, but generally the entire land that they range is seen as part of their territory and their perhaps even ancestral grounds, or having some personal or community significance. And at this time, there's another way of doing land ownership. Interlinked groups have banded together, elected or chosen or been unified by a leader of sorts, a council or an individual warlord, it doesn't really matter. But their land is all now pushed together, owned as a block by the chief or the king. Land now exists as part of a hierarchy, part of the process of nation building, whereby from the top, ownership cascades down and is given in various parcels. Land is subdivided as part of a greater unified, potentially, nation or tribe or large clan. So now we have a system that more reflects what the modern concept of a nation is. So now we are closer to what we would see in the modern world as a nation. An individual, a council on top, who sits and divides the land that is possessed by them into smaller regions, which are granted to their most loyal followers so that they may live in them. This is kind of an inevitability once land becomes large enough. One person cannot personally rule everything in what would be considered a mid-sized nation today, even. But these people who are given land to live on need workers, so they allow others to live on their land in the condition that they work and pay either taxes or give their goods that they produce to their landlord. And the guy on the top gets his taxes from these landlords who he directly appointed to control certain regions. Since these landlords' ownership of land is also conditional on the favour of whoever is in charge, they have jobs to do as well. They are not just tax collectors, they are inspectors, they are soldiers, often to be called as generals or leaders for the higher-ups army, at bringing some of their own retainers with them as well. But it's not like the other methods of living as communities of people disappear. We still have tribal groups and nomads existing alongside this proto-feudal system. Now it's 1300. East Polynesian settlers have just set up camp on Aotearoa, which is the last major unsettled landmass in the world, not counting Antarctica. The world is full. Each place has people living in or near it, or at least some sort of nation claiming ownership of it. Indeed, the world is often subjected to multiple claims of ownership, which is the cause for most of the wars in history. So naturally, for any expansionist individual who does not wish to be at war with another major power, there are really only two avenues. Either you try to take land from the nomads and tribes who are often less socially organised into what we would now call nations, or you sail to try and find somewhere brand new. Aotearoa would be colonised and annexed by the British in 1840, and it is now known as New Zealand. And 300 years earlier, the newly discovered American continent was subject to colonisation by many of Europe's great powers as well. Roughly contemporary to the takeover of Aotearoa, we see the closing of the American frontier, where a relatively new form of land ownership is being experimented with, ignoring, of course, the legitimate claims of the indigenous peoples. This new method was rather interesting. It allowed people to stake a claim to a piece of land simply by living there and farming it for a certain length of time. This is really quite rare in the grand scheme of things. It is very rare for a private class of persons who are not either nobles or merchants by this point, because merchants have had their own kind of housing revolution, as it were, to own land at all in much of the world. Owners of land back in Europe, they were wealthy, titled, privileged individuals. And, well, here we had a chance for the honest working man to go west and find himself a patch of land, farm it, and make his way, manifest his destiny. At least, that was the dream. In reality, even this new frontier devolved quickly into ranchers with huge swaths of land who let tenant farmers and workers live on their land as landlords. In Britain, by as late as 1920, only a quarter of houses were owned by the people who occupied them. At this point, mortgages are just beginning to be available for regular people. And over the next half century, the concept of mass personal home ownership, as opposed to perpetual tenancy, becomes normal. For the first time in many nations around the world, normal people are able to own the land that they live on, which would be wholly unremarkable looking at this from a tribal or nomadic civilization perspective, where communal land ownership is the expected norm. Of course, that's if we can hear their perspectives and they haven't been pushed out of those ancestral lands already. From here, we head inescapably towards modernity, where mortgages are again becoming a less likely prospect for disenfranchised young people. And for the last 20 odd years, at least in Britain, home ownership rates have been falling again. Renting is back, landlords are back, and sympathy and patience for both are in the toilet. The global adoption of modern capitalism as ruling philosophy, which causes said land to be overturned to purposes like broad-scale cattle farming, for example, and the wide-scale adoption of debt as the primary tool for national, personal, and corporate strategy. We are recreating an environment where to own your own home is becoming more and more of a distant dream, and more of a divider between certain social groups, especially in terms of age. Except there's a key difference in the way that this is happening in the modern world. Because for a 50-year stretch at the end of the 20th century, this wasn't a fantasy. So what? Am I trying to say that seeing one's recent historical peers achieving something that is or feels impossible in the modern world has caused this generation's creatives to build systems into their fantasy worlds where this concept of home ownership is indeed actually feasible? Partly. Let's now look at classic fantasy stories. In both The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, characters who are reasonably well off leave their comfy, cosy homes and their droll little lives to go on an adventure. Odysseus leaves his life in a palace based on duty. He is already a king, but he must go to war, go to sail the seas and experience great adventure on the way back. Ned Stark is called from his lordly castle by his king to leave home, thus kicking off a grand, messy conflict which sees his children and his family scattered to the winds outside Winterfell. Even the modern glut of wizard schooling fantasy does the same thing. Almost every single one of these wizard schools is, for some reason, a bloody boarding school. The classic model of fantasy sees the hero settled. Then a call to adventure, some umming and ahhing, and eventually they set out on their adventure to do the quest. From Gilgamesh to Gandalf, if home is mentioned at all, it is to bookend the adventure. It is a place to leave. And if you're lucky, it is a place to return home at the end, having been changed by your experience. Heck, in Gandalf's case, it's not even clear if he has a home. But a huge trend in fantasy gaming now is base building. The more granular, the better, and it has been for over a decade now. This base building, crucially, doesn't bookend the adventure. Rather, the home base becomes something of a through line for the story. It grows, it is developed, and it becomes grander as the character also grows. It is a feature of progression in these games. And the high drama of the story is readily contrasted with the mundane domesticity of building up a home and decorating and making it pretty. The mighty Dragonborn, guild master of most of the guilds of Skyrim, spends their free time building a small log house by a babbling brook in the middle of nowhere, while adopting orphans and pets. But it's not just fantasy games that are becoming dominated by domesticity. A good portion of modern fantasy publishing is now cozy fantasy, which sees our classic fantasy figures and tropes, such as witches, orcs, and demons, put into domestic settings. Perhaps we see a coven of witches running a bookshop, a flat share between a minotaur, mermaid, and magician. Slice of life fantasy has also grown to a fairly large market share of fantasy anime in the last few decades. More and more, our stories are starting to feature the home, or be built around the fantasy of building up a derelict shell into something beautiful, gorgeous that we can all be proud of and live with our happy community of friends inside. And we're starting to see features of fantasy heroes who don't have high social status, such as Odysseus, King of Ithaca, the Starks, Lords of Winterfell, or Thorin Oakenshield, King of Durin's Folk. The use of noble or lordly figures as our classic fantasy heroes makes some degree of historical sense, by the way. It was the nobility who had the means, the power, and the legal freedoms to journey further as either diplomats or warriors or generals, leading their retinues, taking along their armies, or whatever. They were the ones who had the power for not just social mobility, but political mobility and actual mobility historically as well. From at least the end of the Black Death in the 1350s in Europe, the concept of the hero of a folktale actually being of the people and not some high-ranking court official, a knight perhaps, or even a jester, or some sort of bard, was just unreasonable. The concept of a mythic hero being a serf, not a king, was so absurd that it didn't bear making stories about. Even in the modern day, oftentimes our heroes can't escape the weight of dynasty. The latest Star Wars trilogy cannot escape its circling around the Skywalker line. And even Harry Potter, an orphan boy who is mistreated by his adoptive family to say the least, stuffed in a cabin under the stairs, finds out not only he is the last heir of a great wealthy line, the Potters, he is also a direct descendant of the Peverils, three of the greatest mages to ever live, who tricked death himself. Nowadays, in modern fantasy, this is no longer a universal trend, as social mobility and class structures have become less rigid in these times. Our stories, our protagonists, and our heroes are getting more diverse. A charge which was honestly pretty well led by Terry Pratchett himself, who includes an awful lot of characters in prime positions in his stories who don't have that traditional mould of being wealthy or titled. They're just people who go off to do people jobs, and the stories around them flow as naturally as any other fantasy work. But just as it has been absurd to write a fantasy story about someone who did not have the social class or social mobility to actually go an adventure, for much of history it has also been equally absurd to write a story about someone who begins with no land, who eventually becomes a great leader and warrior, despite the fact that that kind of does happen sometimes, at least. The adventure novel is probably the perfect example of this sort of thing that I'm discussing. Between their origin in the early 18th century to their heyday in the mid to late 19th century, the world, and especially the British Empire, was becoming more connected more quickly than ever before. Colonial expansion was the theme of the day, but such foreign places were inaccessible, largely, to the youth of the day, who were the target market of the early adventure novels. We see explorers and adventurers setting off into unspoiled jungles, and sanitized descriptions of semi-real places with all of the actual conflicts and colonization kind of stripped or scrubbed away. The locals and the natives constructing essentially a fantasy world where the indigenous population did not have rights or legitimate claims or things to say or people to stab over the moving in of imperial dominion. Instead, these stories are often filled with wild beasts and crazed cannibal savages. It is still an escape, though. A fantastical escape from rapid urbanization and industrialization that these younger readers would be expected to be experiencing. But the critical fact is that these were not pure fantasy. These adventurers, these soldiers, the explorers, they were kind of on the verge of reality, just so geographically far and so culturally far from what the reader was experiencing that it became impossible to access per se. With the ridiculous rate of expansion, the mad, strange tales of the wilds beyond could well be out there somewhere just beyond the next hill. Kings leaving their palaces and going on long voyages to go to war with all of their retainers and making a hash of their way back was a common enough understood practice to the Greeks who made those stories. Masses of monsters and men waging war with untold machinery of war and moving parts. Well, that made sense. This epic fantasy style made sense to people who had just experienced a world at war. To a generation that has seen their ancestors, their relatives and their peers benefit from lower mortgage rates, comparatively lower house prices, and greater public trust in the mortgage and banking industry, they're now experiencing the exact opposite of all these counts. Home ownership is close enough to be a comprehensible fantasy, but it is still far enough away from reality, at least in their self-perception, that it is still an escape. And all these fantasy worlds, where our protagonists actually get to own stuff, operate by very different logic. Not just the logic of, your great uncle goodness knows what has died and left you an entire mansion. Now build it up as you save the world. These worlds tend to operate with a high degree of trust in currency and lenders. They often have vast swaths of untamed frontier-esque land. And most of the time they don't present us with an economy that is based in feudal norms or rigid social class structures. Even our fantasy heroes who start with nothing may eventually become a lord or a king. Go from prison to being in charge of literally everything. That's the tale of every modern Elder Scrolls game. And inflation is not a key world-building feature of much of fantasy media either. Currency is often tied to material value in these worlds, or at the very least, if they are using paper money, it's more like the paper money used in 11th century China. Wealth is still tied to physical goods most often, and speculative investment markets are very uncommon in these worlds. This may partly be due to the limitations of especially fantasy games, because having a fixed price for each item makes the most sense as a gameplay shortcut. Or perhaps its authors not wanting to go that deep into economic world building. But the tacit, even unconscious removal of these factors that caused our real world financial crashes on multiple occasions, their removal means that these fantasy worlds are less volatile, less unstable, and more prone to allowing for broader social mobility and the purchase and ownership of property. There is often an assumption, especially in game worlds, where if you enter a house, you can assume that the person living inside it owns that house. Unless we're talking specifically about fantasy, which tries to get as close to a feudal environment as possible. Stuff even further on than A Song of Ice and Fire and The Witcher. Fundamentally, when we look at the actions of humans from early humans all the way to now, there are a few key drivers. Exploration, settlement, community, and survival. Our fiction tends to bounce between focusing on these things when our social fabric starts to shift in one direction or another. And right now, the youth yearn for a home, a community, a place to call their own. The last few hundred years have turned the home from a place of work where land is obligation to a place of refuge from work. They are separate categories. And it's no small wonder then that in cozy fantasy, our favourite genres, our favourite shows, our favourite books, we're seeing a surge in people looking to settle. Because in a world in which the fulfillment of one of our latent human drivers is so tantalisingly close, and yet so far from our material reality, just like our 19th century boys dreaming of exploring the far reaches of the jungle, hacking through to find ancient temples, our fiction reflects our hopes and dreams. The last few years have robbed an entire generation of community, and the prior few decades have decimated their chances of settling in a land that is their own. Not all fantasy is escapism. Not all fantasy is escapism. Not all fantasy is wish fulfillment. But the fantasy of home ownership is alive and kicking, as the practicality of it for an entire generation slowly fades. And that's where we're going to end it. I hope this has been an interesting one, at least, and hasn't been too depressing for certain aspects of the community of which I am discussing. But I thought it a fascinating topic as to how much our social landscape shapes our fantastical hopes and dreams. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.